So many of you, I'm sure, have seen that the Vatican recently released this statement that I'm looking at that I have up on the screen here that is called Dignitas Infinita, Declaration on Human Dignity. And this particular document addresses a number of issues, and it's probably worth looking at a number of the issues that are mentioned here. But I want to talk about one thing in particular, and that is what's actually in the title in this particular document. Now, purpose of this video is not to be a polemic against Rome. The point of this video is to just think through the kind of language that is being used here and just ask, is this beneficial language or not? Talking about humanity as having an infinite dignity. So when we're talking about the, infinity, the language of infinity generally is language that we associate with God primarily, right? So we speak about God as one who is infinite. And we have, for example, this is Thomas Aquinas' Summa here, where Thomas Aquinas says very blatantly, the infinite cannot have a beginning, as said in Physics 3, but everything outside God is from God, as from its first principle. Therefore, besides God, nothing can be infinite. So it's clear that, at least in some sense that we're speaking about here, we look at Thomas Aquinas, it is denied that anything other than God can be infinite. Now we're looking at this one particular source, which is Thomas Aquinas here. And when you look at the Lutheran scholastics, who I spend time in, especially someone like Johann Gerhard, when he deals with divine infinity, he basically just explicitly reiterates what Aquinas says here regarding the nature of infinity. So there's something about infinity that is divine. And this is also something you see reiterated in Duns Scotus especially, and then Francis Pieper, the Lutheran systematic theologian from the early 20th century, late 19th century, he speaks about God largely in terms of his infinity. And so there's a very common Christian tradition that has been inherited since, really forever, since the patristic era, that speaks about the infinity of the divine nature as something that identifies God as unique, as other than beings. However, there is another sense of infinity that can be spoken of, and I have this up in the Summa right here as well. So Thomas Aquinas says, things other than God can be relatively infinite, but not absolutely infinite. For with regard to infinite as applies to matter, it is manifest that everything actually existing possesses a form, and thus its matter is determined by form. But because matter, considered as existing under some substantial form, remains in potentiality to many accidental forms, which is absolutely finite, can be relatively infinite. As for example, wood is finite according to its own form, but still it is relatively infinite, inasmuch as it is in potentiality to an infinite number of shapes. Okay, so the point that Aquinas is making here is there is a metaphysical infinity or an ontological infinity that we are speaking of, which is an absolute infinity that applies to God alone, that does not apply to anything created, to any creatures whatsoever. And there is some sense in which you can call something finite, or something that is metaphysically or ontologically finite, infinite in some sense. So here we have the example of wood, right? You could take wood and you could cut it up into a bunch of different shapes, and this is theoretically, there is an infinite number of shapes, say, that wood could take, or watch, a fire and the way that the fire spreads and the shapes that it makes. There's a kind of theoretical infinity to the kind of shapes that fire could make. And you think about this probably most commonly in mathematical terms, where we have, an infinite series of numbers. And so an infinite series of numbers is, in some sense, infinite in that it is a series that can go on forever. However, it is an infinite series of finite things, because numbers are finite things by nature. So it is not an ontological infinity, because everything that has a form, and matter as well, is limited by its not being other forms, right? So a finite thing is limited by its not being other things. Now, you may say, okay, well, God also is not other things. God is not a creature. But the distinction between God and finite things is different in that God is differentiated from finite things by his lack of limitation. So that when we think about the terms that we commonly use to speak about God, so that God is omnipresent. Well, when we say God is omnipresent, what we're really saying is that God lacks those limits that we have of place. He's not limited to place in the way that we are. And this is true about the way that we attribute things to God generally. So our limitations distinguish us from other created objects that also have limitations. So my not being something else is a limitation on me, and it is a limitation on you. What differentiates us to some degree is limitation. We have different bodies and circumstances and all sorts of other things, and experiences of time and lengths of time that we have been on this earth, and locations and all sorts of other things that we may want to put into that category. So God himself is infinite in a unique sense that nothing else is. So with all of that background being given for the basic categories of infinity that we look at in theology here, then I want to ask, what are we talking about in terms of the infinite nature of human dignity that shows up in this document? And then, is that a valid and helpful way to communicate about the human person? All right, so I'm going to move over here to this declaration. So let's see. I'm going to move down a little bit. I'm just going to read a couple parts of this. This says here, the dignity of every human being can be understood as infinite, Dignitas Infinita, as Pope St. John Paul II affirmed in a meeting for people living with various limitations or disabilities. He said this to show how human dignity transcends all outward appearances and specific aspects of people's lives. And I think this is a bit confusing here, because the language of infinite is used here. The dignity is infinite, but then what defines that dignity as infinite? Well, what the document states is that the reason that JP2 said this was because human dignity transcends all outward appearances and specific aspects of people's lives. And so what seems to be the case is that what's really being argued for is a transcendent dignity. In other words, a dignity that is not dependent upon particular circumstances or particular persons. In other words, this is a universal. So everything that shares in a human nature has dignity as a quality of what human nature is. It possesses dignity. And so that is true regardless of what, say, like accidental distinctions may exist between particular persons or circumstances. And in this instance that's being cited here, this is saying that people with disabilities, right? Dignity, human value, these things are not in any way dependent upon the proper functioning of the body. So that if your body does not have proper functioning because of a disease or because of a birth defect or because of whatever, some injury or something else, that doesn't decrease the dignity of humanity. So it seems to me what's really being said, or at least what the document is kind of trying to communicate, is that dignity is universal, or the dignity is, again, transcendent, maybe is the best term to use here, which is mentioned there in that paragraph. So I don't know why they don't simply just use the term transcendent. But then I'm going to go to another definition that we have in the document here. It says, every human person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being, which prevails in and beyond every circumstance, state, or situation the person may ever encounter. So that seems to be getting across the same idea, that what infinite really means is transcendent, or something that is a universal attribute of humanity. So this is, I do find it interesting, the language that's used here, and I want to talk about this, but I know that's beyond the scope of this short video I'm making here. But a lot of language of contemporary liberalism is used, so even the language of dignity and the language of inalienable dignity, and then we also have, as we move on to point 2 in the introduction, a reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's all pretty significant, but I'll set all of that aside for the time being. So there's a critique that I have of this language here. I think that the language is very confusing. Why do I think the language is very confusing? Well, first of all, because historically, generally within Western theology, when we are speaking about infinity, again, this is something which distinguishes God from creatures, unless what we are doing is describing some kind of secondary definition of infinity that's usually clearly outlined within the text itself. And this is what good theology does, is that in philosophy, we characterize our terms very clearly, and if we're using a term outside of its kind of generally understood sense, that we define what that means. This argument does that actually pretty well with other topics, but here it doesn't make, I think, the necessary qualifications to define exactly what is meant by the use of language of infinity here. And so if we're speaking about the nature of God's infinity versus human finitude, there are two reasons why that I'm going to give here, why that's really important that we keep those distinct. One is simply just because this is the creature-creator distinction. As Aquinas says in the Summa, there is a distinction between the infinity of God and everything that exists, that makes God God. It is precisely his infinity that makes him divine, and makes him other than creatures. So there's that. That's pretty essential. But the second is the nature of how we understand the atonement. So if you look at like classical Western atonement theology, at least the medieval period on, and so that also was within the Lutheran tradition, we're part of that kind of Anselmian tradition coming from St. Anselm. St. Anselm, in his book, Credeus Homo, Why God Became Man, outlines the reason why it is that the incarnation had to occur. Why did the incarnation have to happen? Well, the answer that Anselm gives is that the incarnation had to happen because there was no other way for the infinite dishonor that sin wrought to God could be repaid. So his argument is basically this: God has infinite honor. And this infinite honor is, again, what distinguishes God from creatures. So if I offend a finite person, I can actually rectify that because we are finite persons. If I sin, or if I commit a crime against some other fellow human being, I can actually pay for that crime because it's a finite crime. Against God, however, God is an infinite being, and because of God's infinity, that means that when I sin against God, I have committed what is an infinite offense. And so because I have committed an infinite offense against God, if I sin, and when I sin, that means that the restitution for that is also infinite. And God's honor, being infinite, being offended, means that my sin causes infinite dishonor. And we don't tend to use the honor-dishonor language. That's Anselm's language, and we tend to speak about justice, satisfaction, those types of words, but we're essentially putting forth the same idea here. So that if I sin against God, his justice, his infinite perfect justice, demands that there is a restitution. Again, that is infinite, to repay that. I can't do it. That is why an infinite God, the Son of God, the second person of the Holy Trinity, takes upon himself as infinite, in sharing that infinite divine nature as the eternal Logos, takes upon himself a finite human nature, and in doing so, he satisfies the sins of the world because of the hypostatic union. So because of the hypostatic union, there is this infinity that is given to the work of the human Christ. So this is part of the mystery of the incarnation, the theanthropos, the God-man, so that the Christ who dies is not just a nature that dies, right? So we have the God-man, the person of the Son dies by means of the human nature, and in doing so, because of his infinity as the Logos, there is infinite worth and infinite value in the death of Christ. So, with all of that being said, I think the danger that you could run into, besides this kind of mixing up this relationship between creature and creator, is that you end up in a position that if it is really true that the dignity of humanity is actually infinite in the fullest sense, then what that would mean is that, well, that means a human person should be able to simply pay for the sins of the world, right? If a human person is infinite in their dignity and they lay down their dignity on the cross, then like seemingly the incarnation wouldn't be necessary. Now, of course, that's not where the document is going with this, but that I think is the implication, and that's part of my fear about using this kind of language. I think it's very unhelpful language to speak about humanity as infinite. And I know Ed Fazer is the one who brought up this issue on Twitter or X. I always call it Twitter, and this kind of blew up, and things got a little heated toward Fazer's critiques here, and he sees this basically as a kind of a human-centric way of viewing reality. Is now we're speaking about us as being infinite in some sense, and I do think that is a danger. So there's a second thing I want to mention in this document here, and that is the second point in the introduction. Because the question, of course, is, well, what does it mean by infinite? What kind of infinity? What are we talking about here? So the second point is this ontological dignity and the unique and eminent value of every man and woman in the world. And then we see this is reaffirmed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this means that the UN document, according to this statement by the Vatican here, is tied to whatever it is that's being talked about as this infinite dignity. And it specifically refers to it as an ontological dignity. So we're speaking about something that is ontological, that is infinite, which I think is even much more confusing to say that there is an ontological infinity of every human person. So what's not being said here, and I want to be clear about this, what's not being said here is something like the human nature of Christ has infinity because of the hypostatic union. And this is a debate that occurs between the Lutherans and the Reformed, and in the post-Reformation era, the Lutheran theologians were always making the argument that there is a sense of infinity within the human nature because of the intimacy of the hypostatic union. But we're not talking about the hypostatic union here. And what's also not being said, because you could maybe make the argument that, well, what we're talking about, say, is the beatific vision, so that there is a sense in which human dignity is infinite, in that we partake of that vision of the infinite God, and we are brought into the life of God, and he is infinite, so we share in his infinity in the sense that we receive dignity that is infinite because of that union. That's not what's, like, setting aside that question of what we do with that there, that's not what's being said here either. What's being said is that human beings as such, just as humans, have an infinite dignity, and that infinite dignity then becomes the basis for their individual rights. So that's a pretty big theological statement, especially when you attach the idea of rights and you bring in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into this as well. I think we need to tease that out, but that's for kind of another video. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question. Am I being way too nitpicky with some of this and questioning this language? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So thanks so much for watching, and make sure you subscribe. God bless.